Give it up, Logan Gates, ladies and gentlemen.
Awesome. Well, awesome to be here. Welcome to Big Deal Questions. This is the last session before we break to the chat room. But actually, I'm going to pick up on this guy from Ireland who actually has been mentioned a few times today. I want to talk about C.S. Lewis. I want to talk about a bit of his story. C.S. Lewis was born in Northern Ireland. And, I don't know if you know a lot about Ireland. He was born there about turn of the 20th century, early 1900s. More to Ireland than leprechauns and Lucky Charms. Actually, for Lewis, he grew up front row seat on some of the worst religious violence of his time. A lot of conflict between Protestants and Catholics in that part of the world, even still today. And that, together with the time he then spent as a soldier in World War I, the suffering he saw there, it brought him to then, basically, he was just, not much older than you guys, starting university as a convinced atheist. Between the violence he saw religion caused, between the suffering that he experienced, he came to university, went to the University of Oxford to study English. He came as an atheist. What's interesting is that over the course of his studies in Oxford, he met this guy, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, you guys know, C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, right? One of the greatest stories of our time. J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. The book nerd part of me, really wish I could have been part of that friendship. But what's interesting about this friendship was that Tolkien was a committed Christian. Lewis, at this point, was an atheist. Over the course of his studies, he became more open to the idea of God, but there was one point when he mentioned to his friend Tolkien, I'm open to the possibility of there being a God, but I don't understand what this guy who lived 2,000 years ago could have anything to do with that question, the God question, or how relevant he could be to my life today. And Tolkien and Lewis had this conversation. It happened at Magdalen College late at night, and this conversation would end up being pivotal in C.S. Lewis's own life. It set him on a path where he did eventually come to see the Christian faith is really true. But what Tolkien suggested to him was an idea Lewis had never thought about, a way of seeing the Christian faith that was new. Tolkien said, I see the Christian faith as a true myth. A true myth. Now, Lewis, of course, studying English, he loved stories. He loved myths. That was the particular kind of story that he liked. The two of them met in a group that was reading Nordic myths of war and valor and courage and bravery and good and evil. And these are the stories that Lewis loved. And what Tolkien was saying to his friend was, when we think about the Christian faith, what we have here is another kind of story. Except with one key difference, that this story is really true, that this story really happened. Now, Lewis was intrigued by this idea, but he definitely was still skeptical, particularly about this part of the Christian faith really being true, the Bible actually being a book about history. And so what he decided to do was to, give vent to the skeptical side of him. And he said, I'm going to explore this question with my friend, who he knew was an atheist. He knew was pretty robustly against religion. And he was a professor of history at this same university in Oxford. And he asked this professor about this thing he'd heard from his friend, Tolkien, whether this Bible, whether the stories, particularly surrounding the person of Jesus, were really seen as true. And what's interesting about this conversation is that Lewis was taken aback when this professor, not a Christian by any means, said, Lewis, the evidence for the New Testament is actually surprisingly good. Coming from an atheist. Lewis was, taken aback by this, and I just wonder what it would have been like to be a fly on the wall of that office that evening when they had that conversation. What are the kinds of things, the kinds of evidence that this history professor would have brought forward to this skeptical C.S. Lewis? And I imagine that one of the things they would have talked about was the question of whether Jesus actually existed. Now, what's interesting about this question is that even today, there is virtually no professor of history that you can find in any Western university that would maintain that the person of Jesus as a historical figure never existed. Even still today, that would be the case. And why would that be? It's because there's actually a number of sources that aren't in the Bible that talk about Jesus. Here are just three. I choose these three not because they're the only three, but because they're an interesting group to have all together. You have Josephus, a Jewish aristocrat, a historian. You have Pliny the Younger. He was a Syrian philosopher. And then you had Tacitus. He's a Roman statesman. What's interesting about those three, one is that they all come from three different ethnic backgrounds, three different nationalities. You have Josephus is a Jew, Pliny is a Syrian, Tacitus is Roman. They're also from three different career backgrounds, three different vocations. Josephus is a historian, he's an aristocrat. Pliny is a philosopher. Tacitus is a statesman, he's a politician. Three pretty different guys. None of them are Christians. But what emerges from their writing is a common story, a common picture, a consistent one about who this person, Jesus of history, was. They would all maintain that he existed, along with these other biblical figures like Pontius Pilate, that this Jesus was executed by Roman authorities, that there was something that happened after his death that led to a sudden explosive growth of the Christian movement. And lastly, that Jesus was worshiped as God at a very early date. That from the earliest records we have of Christianity, this idea that Jesus was more than a human being, that idea was there. These questions in academic circles today aren't really up for debate. These are questions that are generally accepted to be true. But I imagine as well that the professor in this conversation with Lewis about this good evidence, would probably have talked about the question Lewis really asked him, which was about the Bible, which is about the sources in the New Testament, the part of the Bible that focuses on Jesus. Can we really trust those? I imagine that this historian would have talked about probably how early after the life of Jesus these sources were written down. Because the reality is, when we go to this field of ancient history, we're dealing with something pretty different from the modern, pick up the newspaper today, you read about something that happened yesterday. Take someone like Alexander the Great. You guys all know, we learned about that in primary school, that he really existed. We learned things about his life. The first biography we have of Alexander the Great is written 400 years after his death. That's generally seen as a pretty reliable biography. I imagine this professor talking to Lewis would have brought up how, in comparison, when we come to the books of the New Testament, we're talking about a gap that's just significantly, astoundingly shorter. Even a skeptic, liberal scholar, you go to a place like U of T, they're going to be saying that probably the books of the New Testament are all dated within the first century. They probably are virtually the bulk of the earliest sources we have about Jesus, not something that was thrown together by the Catholic Church a few hundred years later. These are the earliest sources. The earliest of them is probably some of the letters of Paul, written within 20 years of Jesus' life. These are sources drawing on eyewitness accounts. But there's even further back that we could go. There's an atheist German New Testament critic. That's a lot of adjectives. His name is Gerd Ludemann. He makes this case that there's a part of this book of the New Testament called 1 Corinthians. It's a creed. It's a basic statement of Christian beliefs. It's a creed that affirms basic things that Christians would believe today about Jesus, that he died, that he rose, that his resurrection was physical, it was real, it was seen by eyewitnesses. And this is something this atheist scholar argues can be dated within 2 to 3 years after Jesus' death. Now, I imagine you might say to me, Logan, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday or what I did last weekend. How could this guy even remember something that happened 2 to 3 years ago? If I can't remember yesterday, how could someone remember that sort of thing? But I imagine that some of us here probably are going to go on someday to get married. And if that's the case, you are probably going to remember your wedding day for a long time. You're going to remember who was there, what people said to you. Why is that? Well, because it was a different kind of day. And I think in the same way, when it comes to this person of Jesus, whatever you make of him, whatever people made of him in the past, people didn't have a neutral reaction to this guy. The kind of things he was saying about himself, these claims, these hugely arrogant claims about being more than a human being, people really disliked this guy. That's why he was put to death. It wasn't just put to death for being a nice guy, or people fell at his feet and worshiped him. This is the kind of guy who made an impression on you. 2 to 3 years in the field of ancient history, we're dealing with something utterly impressive, utterly unique. Just quickly, I imagine this professor of history probably would have also mentioned to Lewis something about manuscripts. Manuscripts are these physical copies we have of the Bible that are written on pieces of things like papyrus. When it comes to some of these ancient documents, like maybe you guys read Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, maybe you'll face that punishment in university. These are ancient documents. How many of those do we have? How many early copies do we have there? Well, in general, we're talking in the range of several dozens. Not too many, actually, fragments we have of those ancient documents. When it comes to the books of the New Testament, I imagine this professor would have shared that what we have are a whopping 24,000 copies, fragments of the New Testament written in many languages from the first 5 centuries of the church. Imagine maybe one other thing that this professor would have brought up is how there are a lot of things in the Bible that are interesting because if you were inventing this story and getting people to join your movement, you probably wouldn't have, included these things in the accounts that you invented. One of those things is the prominent role of women. I don't know if you know this, that especially for the culture, but I even would say for our culture today, the view of women in the Bible is profoundly counterculturally positive. The fact that there would be women among the first followers of Jesus who financed his ministry, who would be the last people with him at the cross, who would be the first people there at the tomb. This was something that actually gained the Christian faith criticism at the beginning. Women's testimony, especially for this idea of the resurrection, their testimony was not seen as valid in Roman and Jewish courts. And yet, in each of the 4 Gospels, the 4 biographies of Jesus, it's women who are the first witnesses. The question to ask, the question historians ask, is what explains this? Why would this be included if it would so weaken the case on this doctrine of the resurrection, the most important thing that Christians believe, that Jesus, by rising from the dead, he shows that he was who he says he was. Historians look at that question, they say, maybe this is the way it's written down because it really happened. I wish I could have been there to hear what good evidence this atheist professor of history shared with C.S. Lewis that night. It was something that took him aback. But I want to end by thinking about actually the second part of this true myth idea, this idea that it's a story. That's what a myth is at heart. It's a story. And I wonder if we ask the question, if we see the Christian faith as a story, 66 books, written across 1,500 years, what's this story got at its heart? What's the center? What's the essence of this story anyway? I think if we had to choose one verse that brought all of that together, it would probably be something like this one. This is Jesus talking about his own mission in life. He says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." What Jesus is saying is that we're never going to understand his story, never going to understand who he was, if we don't make sense of this laying down his life as a ransom. Now, ransom, this is a word that means sacrifice. And of course, in our stories, the stories we tell today, this idea of a self-sacrifice, this is often something at the heart of the most enduring stories we tell. I wonder how many of you saw the movie Batman Dark Knight Rises? All right, I'm gonna spoil it for you right now because it's been out for like 10 years, so sorry. But you know how that movie ends, right? Is that there's this atomic time bomb in the city of Gotham. It's down to like the final minutes. Batman has managed to find his way into the city, and what he realizes he has to do is take the flying Batmobile and put a cable down to the bomb with a hook, and then he has to fly this thing out over the bay and save the city. Minutes to spare. But, you guys maybe know the story, there's no autopilot on the Batmobile. So, what this means is that Batman is gonna have to stay in the plane while he flies this thing out over the water. It's gonna go off no matter what. And that's what happens. He lifts it out over the bay, it's clear to the city, the bomb goes off, everyone's looking at it, everyone's celebrating, but Batman is not there. And you might know, Batman's identity is a mystery and everything like that. No one really knows who this hidden hero was, but there are a few people who do. One of those persons is Inspector Gordon. Remember what he says at the funeral for Bruce Wayne, for Batman, the man who gave his life for the city? He reads a quote from a book called A Tale of Two Cities. And this is what this quote says. "I see the lives for which I lay down my life, peaceful, useful, prosperous, happy. I see that I hold a sanctuary in their hearts and in the hearts of their descendants generations hence. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." I wonder, why is it that stories like this move us so much? I think Tolkien and Lewis would have us see that the reason why these stories move us is because there's something about a story with a sacrifice in its center that's woven into the fabric of reality, the fabric of the universe, that every other story we tell is an echo perhaps of a deeper story. And at the heart of the story is a sacrifice not just for a city, but for the whole world. At the heart of this is not just a sacrifice that is a rescue from a physical death, but from a spiritual death as well. Maybe some of you here are new to this Christian faith thing. We've heard this message of the cross mentioned a few times, but a lot of people, I think today, you ask the average guy on the street, what do you think about Jesus' death on the cross? A lot of people will say, it was a loving sacrifice on behalf of his friends. But this whole idea that the cross had to deal with my sin, that Jesus received the punishment that I deserved so that I could now be right in God's eyes. I don't buy that part of the cross. I like this idea that it was a loving sacrifice, but this whole idea of sin and judgment, I don't really think that's really true. But I wonder, does that really hold water, that view of the cross? I want us to imagine one last story. Let's say that after this event here, we're still pretty close to Lake Ontario. I know some of you guys have come from east, from west, but let's see, the lake's still pretty close. Let's say we all went down to the lake after this. And as we're walking along the side of the lake, I begin feeling really emotional. Let's say I've gotten to know a lot of you guys throughout the day, and I start to say, I just want to show you guys how much I love you. I just care about you all so much. And what do? I run into the lake, I swim out as far as I can, and I drown. Are you guys gonna look at each other and be like, man, he loved us so much? No, you're gonna be like, who is this crazy guy? I should have seen this coming. Let's change the story though. Let's say that instead of me just running out in the lake and drowning, one of you falls in. A current takes you out. I jump in to save you. I save you, but I drown in the process. Would that be loving? See, that changes the story. And I think in the same way, if for you, Jesus dying on the cross is just some random guy dying, that should not be loving. That's craziness. See, the only way that we can grasp what the cross was about is if we see ourselves in a situation of peril and of danger that this cross has rescued us from. And that danger is this separation from God, that there is a God and that we are far from him, not because some thug like Bane has hijacked our lives, but there's a sense in which all of us have turned away from God. It's been said before, there's a lot of religions that talk about a God of love. Did you know that that's not unique to the Christian faith? But the question to ask is, how do you know? How do you know what God's really like? How do you know he really loves you? Someone can tell you over and over how much they love you. I love you, I love you, I love you. But if you never see that love in action, how do you know that love's really there? So this is where instead of just giving you words about God's love, the Christian faith gives you a story. And at the heart of that story is the cross. A true story, written not on the pages of a book, but on the pages of history. When we ask this question, why trust the Bible? Of course, we're asking it maybe historically in one sense, but there's the question as well on the personal level. Can I really trust the Bible personally? The Bible is not just a story about God's love, it's a blueprint about a new kind of life that we can live. It's a story of love, but it's also an invitation to respond to that story. I wonder if you've ever been to a movie that you've looked forward to so long, it's coming out, and finally the day comes, you invite your friends, you go out to the theater, you watch the movie, it meets your expectations, and you're sitting in the chair of the theater, and the movie ends, and the credits roll, and your friends start to get up, and you say, no, wait, I have to watch all the way to the end. And they're like, what? And you're like, no, just wait, just let me sit in this moment. Why do we do that? I think it's because there's something about powerful stories that they take us from the anxiety and the stress, the challenges of the life that we're facing. It sort of lifts us out, and for that 2-hour period or whatever, we're brought on this other plane of reality, and we're enveloped in something greater than ourselves, and it gives us a courage and a confidence that we didn't have before. And I think the best stories are ones that actually we don't just want to see, we want to be a part of. I'll close with this quote. Lewis says, "We do not merely want to see beauty. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it." want to leave you with the question, what story are you a part of? What story is your life a part of? Do you see yourself as part of a grander narrative that gives you a hope and a purpose and a meaning that you didn't have before? And I want to say, I think that you can. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Logan.